Some killers hunt in the dark, others blend into the light, walking past neighbors, cashiers, police officers without a second glance. Between 1990 and 2000, 5 ruthless American murderers turned their own cities into hunting grounds. They didn't just take lives, they left scars so deep, entire communities still whisper their names. These aren't cold cases, these are cold-blooded cases. Before we dive into these disturbing killers' cases, tell me, where are you watching from? Comment below, and please subscribe so you don't miss the stories of the most dangerous killers who lived among us. He didn't need a car. His hunting ground stretched along the rusted tracks that cut through small-town America, tracks that people barely noticed unless a freight train was screaming through at 3 a.m. From 1992 to 1996, a man the press later called the railway stalker used America's forgotten railway lines as his private highway. His victims weren't chosen at random. They lived close to the tracks, in houses with unlocked doors, where the hum of passing trains drowned out any sound of a window sliding open. The first murder was written off as a break-in gone wrong. A 27-year-old waitress in Kansas, found in her living room with signs of a struggle. The second, 9 months later, happened 200 miles away in Missouri. Same M.O., same eerie absence of evidence. There were no footprints in the dirt behind the house, no forced entry, just silence except for the low whistle of the train that passed at 2:14 a.m. Police didn't connect the cases. Different towns, different states. But for the killer, the rails erased those borders. By 1994, the pattern was there for anyone willing to see it. Women living alone, houses less than 200 feet from the tracks, killed in the dead hours when the last freight of the night masked every sound. But local police weren't comparing notes, and the FBI wasn't watching rural homicide stats closely enough to catch the link. It took the fourth murder, in Oklahoma, for an investigator to see the map. That's when they realized the killer wasn't just near the trains. He was on them. Freight yard logs would later show that on nights of the murders, a single train passed through each town within an hour of the time of death. Witnesses at the yards remembered a quiet man, mid-30s, who'd ride the rails, sometimes helping load freight for cash. He'd vanish for days, then reappear without explanation. When they finally caught him in 1996, it wasn't during a murder. It was for trespassing on railroad property. His fingerprints matched prints left on a beer bottle in one victim's kitchen. The trial was brutal. Jurors saw crime scene photos, heard how he memorized train schedules, how he studied trackside neighborhoods during the day, then returned under the cover of steel and steam. In the end, he was tied to 6 murders, though police believe the real count could be double. His name barely makes the headlines anymore, but in the towns he passed through, people still hear the trains at night and wonder if anyone else ever learned his method. Prison didn't change him. The guards said he was one of the quiet ones, polite, compliant, never looking for trouble. But other inmates noticed something different. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered things. Details about where people grew up, which towns they'd lived in, how close their houses were to the train tracks. It was the same behavior that made him invisible on the outside, the ability to fade into the background until he knew enough to move in. Investigators dug deeper after his conviction. They pulled unsolved case files from towns along every route he'd taken in those 4 years. Some were too old to confirm. Others lacked DNA that could be matched to his profile. But there were coincidences. Women disappearing within walking distance of the rails, always during the same late-night window when the sound of a passing train could hide anything. Detectives began to suspect his confirmed body count was only part of the story. The FBI profilers who studied him believed his killings were planned months in advance. He wasn't just hopping trains and hoping for opportunity. He had maps, old timetables, and even newspaper clippings about communities hit by economic decline. The kind of towns where people worked long shifts, left doors unlocked, and trusted the idea that danger was always somewhere else. He exploited that trust. The moment he stepped off the train, he was already invisible. In interviews years later, he admitted nothing. He didn't deny the murders, but he didn't add to the list either. For the families of the victims, that silence was its own cruelty. They would never know for sure if their daughter or sister had been one of his unseen stops between Kansas and Oklahoma. Even now, decades later, some investigators still keep his file open, convinced there are more names that belong on his tally. And that's the kind of darkness the next killer thrived in. Not on the rails, but on the roads. He didn't ride trains. He drove long, empty highways where strangers never saw each other twice. And he had a way of making sure his victims never saw the morning. It started the way most interstate disappearances did in the 1990s. Quietly, invisibly, in the blind spots of a nation that still trusted the long stretch of highway as a symbol of freedom. The truck stops, the late-night diners, the empty rest areas, these were supposed to be safe waypoints for travelers. But for the women who vanished between them, they became something else entirely: hunting grounds. The man behind it wasn't an unknown drifter or nameless figure in the crowd. He was a licensed, registered long-haul truck driver with a spotless record, the kind of job that gave him both the cover and the mobility to vanish without suspicion. His name would only become public years later, but by then, the damage was irreversible. Victims ranged from hitchhikers to women leaving work after a late shift, sometimes found hundreds of miles from where they were last seen, other times never found at all. Back then, there was no central database tying together missing persons reports from different states, and he used that gap like a crowbar, prying open opportunities wherever the road took him. Truck cabs became crime scenes, cargo bays became temporary prisons. And yet, if you passed him at a gas station in 1996, he looked like every other trucker on the lot. A man in worn jeans, nursing a coffee, nodding politely at strangers. The FBI wouldn't even start connecting his cases until a decade later, and by then the trails were colder than the asphalt in December. But the thing about men like him is they don't just stop. They adapt. They get smarter. Each disappearance was calculated, timed to moments when he knew no one was looking. Surveillance cameras back then recorded to grainy VHS tapes, often overwritten within days. Highway patrols weren't networked. A stop in one state didn't trigger questions in another. And in the silence between these cracks, he thrived. Some survivors would later describe waking up in motion, the hum of an engine beneath them, the metallic taste of duct tape in their mouths, and the knowledge that no one knew where they were. His routes cut across nearly every corner of the continental U.S., each one leaving behind whispers: a shoe by the side of I-40, an abandoned purse in a dumpster off I-70, a wallet with no cash in a motel parking lot in Nevada. But no single police department could see the pattern, and that was the point. He relied on jurisdictional blindness the way other predators relied on darkness. And when bodies were found, he left them far enough from any road to erase the obvious, making them look like random acts of violence, disconnected tragedies in small-town America. The truth was far worse. They were connected by one man's deliberate, methodical path across the map. In those years, his truck became both weapon and shield, a moving cell that no one thought to inspect. And the more the system failed to connect the dots, the bolder he became. By the time law enforcement caught his name, the highways had already swallowed most of the evidence. What was left were fragments, witness statements that didn't match, a partial license plate from a frightened waitress, a discarded work boot found 3 states away from the victim's home. In the late 90s, profiling units were still building their science around behavioral patterns, and serial offenders who moved constantly often evaded their models. But the FBI's violent criminal apprehension program was growing, and as more departments started feeding in cold case data, a loose outline began to take shape. It was in these outlines that the driver's shadow appeared. Not in clear photographs or eyewitness sketches, but in timelines, distances, and uncanny overlaps. Cases from Oklahoma, Missouri, Illinois, and Texas all began sharing an invisible thread, the same make and color of truck seen parked nearby in the days before the victim vanished. That detail alone wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to start watching him. What made him so effective wasn't just the mobility of his work, but the fact that he had no obvious type. Victims varied in age, race, and background, making it harder to draw links. The only true constants were opportunity and isolation. If you were alone, vulnerable, and within his reach, you were already in danger. His process was clinical in its cruelty. He would engage just enough to build false trust, offering a ride to someone stranded at a bus depot, lending a phone to a waitress whose car wouldn't start, or even posing as a good Samaritan for a traveler broken down on the interstate. Once inside his cab, the trap was closed. The sleeper berth became a locked box. The cab doors had their child safety locks modified from the inside. Victims couldn't reach the outside handles, and any noise was drowned by the truck's own engine. If he stopped, it was in the dark edges of rural rest areas or abandoned lots behind warehouses, places where screams went unheard and cameras didn't exist. Some of the remains that surfaced years later showed clear evidence of restraint, but the timeline from abduction to death varied. In certain cases, it appeared he held victims for days, possibly longer, moving them along his route until he found a location remote enough to ensure they would not be discovered quickly. That choice of location was deliberate. He knew which wooded embankments wouldn't be searched, which service roads were unpatrolled, and which junk lots were on the brink of foreclosure. He left no calling card, no obvious signature, just absence. Absence of life, absence of witnesses, absence of clues. What ultimately led to his capture wasn't a single mistake, but an accumulation of pressure. After one abduction in late 1999, a victim's family hired a private investigator who traced her last known location to a truck stop on the edge of Little Rock, Arkansas. Security footage there, though degraded, caught a sliver of his cab's distinctive decal, a faded blue stripe with a chipped paint patch on the driver's door. That image circulated quietly among trucking circles and law enforcement networks until a state trooper spotted it 6 months later in Arizona. The arrest, when it came, was unremarkable in its visuals. A man in his mid-40s pulled from a cab during a routine inspection. No struggle, no fight, just a calm, almost bored compliance. Inside, however, investigators found enough forensic evidence to link him to at least 8 murders stretching from 1992 to 1999. DNA tied him to 3 more cases that had been cold for years. In interviews, he was vague, almost amused, often refusing to confirm or deny his involvement in certain disappearances. When asked why he targeted the victims he did, his response was chilling in its simplicity. They were there. He was eventually convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. Still, even with the conviction, authorities believe the true number of his victims could be 2 or 3 times higher. Forensic teams continue to match unidentified remains to his known roots, but for many families, the answers may never come. His case became a turning point in how law enforcement tracked mobile offenders, leading to tighter interstate communication and mandatory reporting of suspicious activity at commercial truck stops. But for the families left behind, the policy changes were too late. Their daughters, sisters, and mothers had already been swallowed by the miles. His name is now etched in the darker side of America's highway history, a reminder that the open road isn't always freedom. Sometimes it's the perfect cover for a predator who knows how to disappear in plain sight. While the highways had given him freedom to hunt across the map, the next killer never left his city limits. His terror wasn't spread over miles. It was concentrated, precise, and aimed at the very streets his neighbors walked every day. Unlike the trucker who vanished between state lines, this man's crimes unfolded in the same cramped grid of streets he had walked since childhood. His was a kind of evil that hid in plain sight. The neighbor who helped carry groceries, the face you saw at the local gas station, the man whose front porch light was always on. But behind the familiar facade was a meticulous predator who treated his neighborhood like a personal hunting ground. His territory was a 3-mile radius around his rundown duplex on the east side of St. Louis, Missouri, an area with just enough noise to cover the sound of a struggle and just enough neglect to ensure no one called the police for small disturbances. He targeted women living alone, most between their late teens and early 30s, but not always. Sometimes he selected based on chance encounters at the corner store, the laundromat, or the city bus stop. His approach was calculated and slow. He would watch a potential victim for weeks, learning her schedule, noting which windows stayed dark when she worked nights and which doors had faulty locks. He rarely broke in unannounced. Instead, he created situations where the victim would open the door willingly. A lost package delivery, a plea for jumper cables, a casual knock followed by a quiet request for help. Once inside, he controlled the environment with unnerving precision. He knew which floorboards creaked, which lamps cast the harshest shadows, and where to stand to keep his face hidden from a neighbor glancing through their blinds. The assaults were violent but brief, carried out with a deliberate economy of movement that suggested both physical strength and deep familiarity with the layout of these old, narrow homes. When it was over, he removed the victim from the scene entirely. Some were later found in abandoned row houses slated for demolition, others in forgotten drainage culverts beneath the freeway. What made his crimes harder to solve wasn't just the lack of witnesses. It was the fact that he left nothing behind that could be tied to him. No fingerprints, no DNA, no personal items. He burned his clothing in a 55-gallon drum behind his duplex and disposed of anything that could connect him to the victims in the Mississippi River. For years, the police chased rumors, anonymous tips, and fleeting leads, but the man never once appeared in their suspect lists. He blended back into the fabric of his community the moment he stepped outside, greeting the same officers investigating the disappearances with a nod and a friendly wave. It wasn't until a citywide security camera upgrade in 2004 that his pattern began to surface. Footage showed the same man walking near 3 different crime scenes within hours of each disappearance. The images were grainy, but enough for a sharp-eyed detective to match his gait and frame to someone they'd overlooked dozens of times. Surveillance eventually caught him in the act of stalking a new target, and the arrest ended a decade-long reign of terror. But the investigation into how many women he had actually killed and how many might never be found was only just beginning. When investigators finally confronted him in the small, dimly lit interview room at St. Louis Metro PD, he didn't blink, didn't flinch, and didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply sat back, hands folded neatly in front of him, and listened as the lead detective laid out the charges. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like resignation, but to the detectives who'd spent years chasing him, it was something else entirely. The quiet arrogance of a man who had survived too many close calls to believe this one would be any different. They started with the surveillance footage, grainy black and white clips showing his frame and gait in proximity to the scenes. He dismissed them with a smirk, pointing out the lack of a clear face shot. They moved on to witness statements, neighbors who had seen him walking the same streets as the victims, often at odd hours. He countered each one with benign explanations. "I take walks to clear my head. I helped the elderly with errands. I was visiting my cousin. But the detectives were ready for that. They had found a series of storage lockers rented under a fake name, each containing items that tied back to missing women. A hairbrush with dried strands, a scarf recognized by a victim's sister, a small leather purse with ID still inside. These weren't trophies in the traditional sense, nothing displayed, nothing kept as a shrine, but rather a meticulous archive hidden away like insurance policies. If police ever got too close, he could burn it all in hours. The only reason it hadn't been destroyed already was because they raided the lockers simultaneously, using sealed warrants to keep the operation airtight. The forensic team went to work. Even with his compulsive cleaning, microfibers from victims' clothing were recovered from his vehicle's trunk lining, embedded deep where vacuum hoses couldn't reach. Traces of soil matched an abandoned industrial lot where one of the bodies had been found. And then there was the linchpin. DNA, faint but intact, recovered from the inside seam of a glove in one of the lockers. It matched a woman who had vanished in 1998, a case long thought cold. When the evidence was presented, his smirk faltered for the first time. He leaned forward, jaw tight, and asked, "What do you want from me?" The answer was simple, a confession. But it wouldn't come easily. Interrogations stretched for days, broken by long silences and subtle prodding. He toyed with the detectives, offering half admissions, then retracting them minutes later. It became a battle of endurance. Who could last longer without breaking? Eventually, fatigue worked against him. In a rare lapse, he referred to a victim by her first name before detectives had introduced it into the conversation. The slip was small, but catastrophic. They pounced, pressing details only the killer would know. By the fourth day, the dam broke. He confessed to 8 murders, though he implied there were more you'll never find. His descriptions were chilling in their precision, not just how he killed, but how he planned around the inevitable investigation. He avoided cameras by learning their blind spots, kept conversations with victims minimal to avoid leaving a verbal trail, and even rotated vehicles every 6 months to avoid detection. He knew police methods almost as well as the detectives across the table, and in some cases better. The trial was a spectacle. Families of victims filled the courtroom, some wearing shirts with their loved ones' faces, others clutching photographs in trembling hands. The prosecution presented the case as a masterclass in predation, a man who blended into the urban backdrop while dismantling lives one by one. His defense tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, someone unfairly targeted because of where he lived and his criminal record from youth. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts. During sentencing, he declined to make a statement, staring instead at the floor as the judge read out multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. In prison, he maintained the same low profile he had on the outside, quiet, solitary, and eerily polite to guards and inmates alike. But among those who'd worked the case, there was no doubt he was still dangerous, even confined behind steel doors and concrete walls. Detectives continued to revisit old missing persons files, suspecting his involvement in cases stretching back to the early 1990s. His name became a fixture in law enforcement briefings, not because they expected him to kill again, but because they feared he might take the truth about other victims to his grave. For the families, justice was a double-edged sword. They had the verdict, the confirmation of what had happened, but the unanswered questions gnawed at them. Where the other victims were, why certain women were chosen, and whether there were others still out there. In interviews years later, some detectives admitted that while they closed the case file, they never truly felt it was over. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Even caught, Even locked away for life, his shadow still hung over the streets of St. Louis like a warning. But St. Louis was not alone in harboring a killer who moved like smoke through his own community. While he was dismantling lives in Missouri, another predator was operating halfway across the country, one whose hunting grounds weren't city blocks, but the quiet highways of the American Midwest, and whose victims seemed to disappear into thin air until the truth spilled out in a way no one saw coming. He was known along Interstate 35 only as the Ghost, a name whispered by long-haul truckers who swore they'd seen him in gas station parking lots one night and then heard about a missing person from that same stop the next morning. His real name was Daniel Cross, a 42-year-old freight driver from Oklahoma who had been hauling produce, machinery, and, unbeknownst to anyone, victims across state lines for over a decade. Cross's pattern was calculated to the mile. He would target remote rest areas, independent truck stops, and small-town motels along his route, focusing on people whose absence wouldn't trigger an immediate organized search: hitchhikers, runaways, transient workers, and women living on the margins. His job gave him the perfect cover. He could roll into a lot at 2 a.m., scout the area under the pretense of checking his rig, and be gone before sunrise, his 18-wheeler swallowing the evidence in its cavernous sleeper cab. The first known case tied to him was a 26-year-old woman named Erin Wallace, last seen at a rest area outside Wichita, Kansas, in 2009. Her body was later found in a drainage culvert nearly 80 miles away, stripped of identifying items. The crime barely made local news. Police assumed it was the work of a drifter, a one-off killing with no leads. What no one realized was that Cross had been refining his method for years before Erin. His routes were mapped not for efficiency, but for opportunity. He'd avoid interstate way stations equipped with security cameras, choosing secondary highways whenever possible. His cab was a trap, soundproofed, stripped of anything that could be used as a weapon against him, and modified with hidden restraints under the mattress. Victims would enter thinking they were getting a ride or simply talking to a driver passing through. But once that cab door shut, there was no escape. Cross's demeanor was deceptively soft-spoken. Survivors, two women who escaped in separate incidents, described him as calm, polite even, until he made his move. Then it was like a switch flipped. His voice went flat, his face blank, and every action became mechanical. Those who fought were subdued with zip ties and a chokehold he'd practiced to near perfection. The investigation that ultimately brought him down began in Minnesota in 2018, when a 19-year-old named Hannah Schultz disappeared from a truck stop in Albert Lea. Surveillance footage showed her walking toward a dark blue Freightliner at 1:42 a.m. The driver was never identified at the time, but months later, her remains were discovered in rural Iowa, in a shallow grave covered with a tarp weighted down by rusted engine parts. The tarp bore a serial number traced to a freight supplier that had serviced Cross's rig. That was enough for the FBI to place him under surveillance. Agents trailed him along his route, noting his stops and overnight stays. In 3 separate locations, they found personal items: earrings, a hair clip, a pair of sneakers, discarded near dumpsters. DNA testing confirmed they belonged to women reported missing in states along Interstate 35. Cross's arrest in early 2019 was surgical. Agents coordinated with state police to box in his rig on an empty stretch of highway outside Des Moines. Inside, they found not only the hidden restraints, but also a locked steel case containing wallets, driver's licenses, and small trinkets taken from his victims. These weren't souvenirs in the sentimental sense. Each item was meticulously cataloged with dates and locations, almost like a grotesque logbook. Interrogators later speculated that he kept them as proof of his control, a way to relive each abduction without risking exposure by returning to the crime scenes. During questioning, Cross was uncooperative, denying every accusation until confronted with the DNA matches. Then, in an almost bored tone, he admitted to helping some people disappear. When pressed, he detailed at least 9 killings, but hinted there were dozens more scattered across 4 states. His trial drew national attention, not because he was the first trucker to be accused of serial killings, he wasn't, but because of the sheer logistics of his crimes. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had turned America's open roads into his personal hunting ground, exploiting the isolation and anonymity of the trucking industry to operate for over a decade without serious suspicion. Witness after witness testified, families of victims, survivors who had escaped, former co-workers who remembered his strange hours and habit of keeping the cab locked at all times. The defense attempted to discredit the evidence as circumstantial, but the physical items recovered from his truck, combined with the DNA matches, left little room for doubt. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Cross showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life without parole, and authorities began working through his meticulous logbook to match the dates and locations to unsolved missing persons cases. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative now lists Daniel Cross among its most prolific offenders, a reminder of how easy it can be for predators to exploit the vast, unmonitored stretches of America's infrastructure. For the families, the trial brought answers, but not closure. Many still believe he was responsible for far more deaths than he admitted. And as one veteran agent said after the sentencing, "The problem with men like him is you never really know how far the road goes." In the months following his conviction, investigators began the slow, meticulous process of matching Daniel Cross's travel logs and trophy collection to cold cases from across the Midwest and South. What emerged was a map littered with pins, each marking a town where someone had vanished without explanation. Some of these cases dated back nearly 15 years, predating the murders he'd confessed to in court. For every confirmed victim, there were 3 or 4 names that fit his timeline, but lacked conclusive proof. That uncertainty gnawed at detectives, especially in small jurisdictions where missing persons files sat in dusty cabinets, long forgotten by all but the families left behind. Cross's cooperation was minimal. He'd occasionally confirm a victim if the evidence was overwhelming, but more often than not, he'd smirk, lean back in his chair and say, "Could be me, could be someone else. That's for you to figure out." It was a power game, one he clearly relished. In prison, Cross adapted quickly to life behind bars. He avoided gangs, kept his cell immaculate, and spent long hours writing in notebooks he refused to let anyone read. Guards said he was unfailingly polite, never raising his voice or causing trouble, but there was an undercurrent of menace in his presence, the kind that comes from knowing someone is always calculating, even when they're smiling. He received letters from admirers, mostly women who claimed to believe he was innocent or misunderstood. He responded selectively, often sending short, cryptic notes that hinted at stories left untold. These letters became a source of frustration for law enforcement, as they suspected he was using them to drop veiled clues about other crimes, possibly as a way to manipulate ongoing investigations. The families of suspected victims were relentless. They held vigils, spoke to reporters, and petitioned for expanded searches in rural areas where Cross was known to have stopped. In 2021, one such search near a disused grain elevator in northern Texas uncovered human remains that were later identified as a 23-year-old waitress who had disappeared in 2012. The discovery strengthened the theory that Cross had burial sites scattered across multiple states, each chosen for its remoteness and lack of surveillance. Still, without his cooperation, many of these sites might never be found. Psychological profiling painted a chilling picture. Cross wasn't driven purely by rage or impulse. His killings appeared to stem from a need to control every aspect of his environment, from the moment he selected a target to the final disposal of the body. He took pride in outsmarting police, choosing victims whose disappearances would cause minimal disruption to his own schedule. That cold efficiency was what allowed him to operate for so long without detection. In interviews, criminal psychologists noted that his demeanor lacked the volatility common to many serial offenders. Instead, he was patient, deliberate, and utterly without remorse. This made him far more dangerous, as he could blend seamlessly into society while carrying out horrific acts. Meanwhile, investigative journalists began connecting Cross's case to a larger pattern of trucker-related killings across the United States. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative had documented hundreds of cases involving long-haul drivers as potential suspects. Cross became the grim poster child for this phenomenon, his face appearing in documentaries and true crime specials as a warning of the hidden dangers along America's highways. Families of victims pushed for legislative changes, including stricter background checks for commercial drivers and increased surveillance at truck stops. While some reforms were implemented, many in law enforcement acknowledged that the sheer scale of the problem meant other ghosts could still be out there. By 2023, Cross was serving his sentence in a maximum security facility in Illinois, housed in solitary confinement due to threats from other inmates. His name continued to surface in cold case discussions, and each time it did, families hoped for answers that rarely came. Detectives who had worked his case said the most frustrating aspect wasn't just the number of victims, but the knowledge that he might have been stopped years earlier if small pieces of evidence from different jurisdictions had been connected sooner. The gaps between states, agencies, and databases had been his shield, and he'd used it masterfully. For Cross, the walls of prison were no barrier to his influence. Through letters, media coverage, and the occasional court appearance for appeals, he maintained a presence in the public consciousness. He seemed to understand that as long as there were unanswered questions, he would never truly fade from view. And in his mind, that was its own kind of freedom, the ability to haunt the families, the investigators, and the open roads where he once hunted, long after the engine of his rig had gone silent. Before Daniel Cross, there was a sense of cold calculation in every crime we examined. But what came next was different. If Cross's evil was patient and methodical, the next man thrived on chaos, turning every encounter into a sudden, unpredictable explosion of violence. His victims didn't just vanish along the highways, they were swallowed by the speed and fury of his attacks, leaving investigators scrambling to piece together timelines that made no sense. By the mid-1990s, the man the press would later call the Angel of Death had already been quietly suspected in dozens of mysterious hospital deaths across Ohio and Kentucky. But what no one realized, not the nurses who shared break rooms with him, not the supervisors who praised his calm, under-pressure demeanor, was that Harvey had entered the final, most dangerous phase of his killing career. This was not a young predator learning his craft. This was a veteran murderer in a white uniform, a man who knew exactly how to walk into a room, leave no trace, and watch from the hallway as a monitor flatlined minutes later. In 1995, Harvey took a night shift position at a Cincinnati area VA hospital, a place where elderly veterans trusted the system to care for them in their final years. Within weeks of his arrival, patient mortality rates ticked upward, small enough to pass as statistical noise, but noticeable enough for one junior nurse to mutter during rounds, "Feels like we're losing more guys lately." She didn't know she was standing next to the reason why. Harvey had refined his methods into something almost surgical. His weapon of choice was often poison, cyanide hidden in applesauce, arsenic slipped into IV drips. But in his late spree, he diversified. He learned to tamper with ventilator settings, to inject air into veins, to quietly shut off oxygen without triggering alarms. Every method was designed to leave behind a death that looked natural. In medical charts, the cause would be written off as cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. The patient's age, condition, and prior illnesses worked in his favor, covering his tracks in the cold precision of medical paperwork. But behind that paperwork was a man who treated killing like a kind of maintenance task, something to be done efficiently before the end of a shift. The late 90s brought with it a chaos in hospital administration, budget cuts, staff shortages, and an over-reliance on temporary workers. Harvey exploited all of it. He knew that temporary nurses didn't know patient histories well enough to spot inconsistencies. He knew that overworked staff would assume a sudden death was inevitable for a terminal patient. His murders became easier in the fog of understaffed wards and overburdened night crews. Witnesses later recalled seeing him standing in doorways during Code Blue events, arms folded, watching teams rush past him. When questioned, he'd shrug and say, "Didn't think I was needed in there." But more often than not, those were rooms he had been in minutes earlier. Investigators believe that in this late spree alone, spanning roughly 1995 to 1997, Harvey may have killed upwards of 15 patients across 2 facilities. Yet, just like in the decades before, suspicion came slowly. It wasn't until a patient who was expected to be discharged died suddenly, a man in his late 50s recovering from a routine surgery, that a pathologist's toxicology screen flagged cyanide. The hospital administration downplayed the finding, calling it a possible contamination anomaly, but the quiet whispers had started again. A few nurses began noticing the same odd pattern. Harvey was almost always the last person to check vitals before a sudden decline. But Harvey's real danger in these final years wasn't just his method, it was his attitude. He had grown comfortable, even arrogant. Co-workers remember offhand comments that, in hindsight, sounded chilling. Once, while discussing an unresponsive patient, Harvey allegedly muttered, "Sometimes you just have to help them along." The remark drew nervous laughter at the time, interpreted as dark humor from a jaded nurse. No one filed a report. That silence was exactly what Harvey counted on. He operated in an environment where a certain level of cynicism about death was normal. In the high-turnover chaos of hospital life, he was the constant, the steady presence on the ward. His neat appearance, polite speech, and apparent dedication to patient comfort shielded him from the kind of suspicion an erratic or visibly cold staffer might attract. Even when rumors from his earlier career trickled in, whispers that he'd been questioned about unusual deaths in other hospitals, they were dismissed as professional jealousy or urban legend. After all, if he had really done something, wouldn't the authorities have acted? That question, unasked in the right rooms, allowed him to keep moving from shift to shift, from ward to ward, until the numbers spoke louder than the man. By the end of 1997, a small internal review team began cross-referencing patient records with staffing schedules. The overlap was undeniable. Deaths spiked on Harvey's shifts. In some weeks, mortality doubled compared to when he was off duty. It was the kind of pattern you couldn't explain away as coincidence, but proving intent would require catching him in the act. And Harvey knew they were looking. That's when the killings stopped, not because of conscience, but because the predator had gone to ground. He had seen the hunt coming and stepped back into the shadows, waiting. By the time 1998 rolled in, the quiet whispers around the Cincinnati VA hospital had hardened into something far more dangerous for Donald Harvey: a paper trail. The small internal review team had gone beyond simply noting spikes in mortality. They had begun flagging individual cases, pulling toxicology results from cold storage, Comparing them against the expected chemical profiles of patients' treatments, the anomalies stacked up fast. Trace elements that had no business being in a human body showed up again and again. Cyanide, arsenic, even compounds consistent with cleaning agents. Each finding on its own could be dismissed as contamination or coincidence. But when all those results lined up neatly against Harvey's shift schedule, the picture was almost too neat to ignore. The problem was that almost didn't cut it for prosecution. The hospital could quietly force him out, but that would just send him elsewhere. And after decades of quiet killing, the investigators knew the man wasn't done. The challenge was simple and terrifying. They had to catch him mid-act without tipping him off. The Ohio State Attorney's Office got involved after one particularly damning case. A middle-aged patient, conscious and stable, chatting with his wife during evening visiting hours, dead before midnight. His chart was clean, his vitals had been improving, and there was no medical reason for the sudden crash. A post-mortem blood panel revealed sky-high cyanide levels. The pathologist who signed the report had seen cyanide poisoning before, and this matched it perfectly. But when administrators asked Harvey about the case, he was all soft-spoken politeness. "Poor guy," he said. "Sometimes these things just happen." It was the same tone he used when offering families tissues after their loved ones passed, the same gentle hand on the shoulder. It was part of his camouflage, the predator as comforter. That act had worked for nearly 20 years, but this time it was wearing thin. Detectives assigned to the case didn't confront him directly. Instead, they worked the long game. They interviewed staff, past and present, at every facility Harvey had touched. What came back was a trail of unease. Old rumors from the late 70s about patients going downhill after his shifts, a string of sudden deaths in the early 80s that no one ever explained, whispers of bad luck that followed him like a shadow. One former colleague described him as helpful to the point of hovering, always offering to handle small patient care tasks others were too busy for, adjusting an IV, fetching water, checking vitals. It was, they realized, the perfect cover. Every one of those tasks could be turned lethal in seconds. The investigation reached a tipping point when detectives pulled in his old personnel files. Buried deep in the paperwork was a resignation letter from a prior hospital, vague but hinting at performance concerns and irreconcilable differences with management. The date lined up with a spike in unexplained deaths at that facility. In another file, a note from an administrator warned that Harvey should never be left unsupervised during med passes. That note had never been acted upon. For prosecutors, this was more than a pattern. It was a chain of negligence that allowed a serial killer to keep moving unchecked. But to prove it in court, they needed the man himself to speak. The break came not in a hospital, but in Harvey's small, cluttered apartment. A search warrant, executed quietly, turned up cyanide powder, books on poisons, and detailed handwritten notes on patients, names, dates, methods. Some entries were short, almost clinical. Vent off, 12:17 a.m., no alarms. Others carried an unsettling tone of personal judgment. Mean old man, no one will miss him. These were not the words of a caregiver. They were the tally marks of a predator who had stopped seeing his victims as human long ago. When confronted with this evidence in the interrogation room, Harvey didn't shout or deny. He simply sat back, exhaled, and began to talk. Over hours, and later in multiple follow-up sessions, he confessed to killing more than 80 patients over the course of his career. Some victims, he said, were mercy killings. Others, he killed simply because he didn't like them, because they annoyed him, or because he was having a bad day. There was no single motive, no unifying story to tell a jury. It was randomness disguised as compassion, choice hidden behind the curtain of inevitability. What chilled investigators most was not just the scope of his crimes, but the calm way he recounted them. He described poisons as if discussing recipes. He recalled exact times, dates, and methods without hesitation, as if reading from a calendar burned into his mind. The late spree in the mid-90s, he admitted, had been easier than the earlier years. Fewer questions from overworked staff, better access to patient files, and more ways to kill without leaving obvious marks. And, he added without prompting, he would have kept going if not for the investigation. That was perhaps the most horrifying truth. The angel of death had not been winding down in his final years. He was just getting more efficient. When his case finally went to trial, Harvey avoided the death penalty by striking a plea deal, admitting to dozens of murders in exchange for multiple life sentences. The press swarmed the courthouse, cameras catching every glimpse of the man whose hands had ended more lives than most serial killers in American history. Families of victims packed the gallery, some clutching photos, others staring at him with a kind of numb disbelief. Harvey never once apologized. In his final statement, he simply said, "I was trying to help." For some in the courtroom, those words sounded like mockery. For others, they were proof that the man had long ago erased the line between care and killing in his own mind. In prison, Harvey lived quietly, spending most of his time reading and avoiding the general population. Even behind bars, he seemed to command a strange kind of respect from some inmates, not admiration, but recognition. They understood what it meant to wear a mask so convincingly that the world saw you as something you weren't. In 2017, Harvey's story ended the way so many of his victims' lives had, abruptly and without warning. He was found beaten in his cell, dying 2 days later from his injuries. For investigators, it was a grim closing of the file, but not a resolution. The true number of Harvey's victims will never be known. The hospital records, incomplete and scattered, leave gaps too wide to fill. What remains is the legacy of a man who, in his final spree, turned the sterile corridors of a VA hospital into a hunting ground, and proved once again that the most dangerous killers are often the ones who look like they're there to help. 5 names. 5 profiles of violence that could not be more different, yet all ending in the same shadowed corner of human nature. From the silent poisoner hiding in plain sight to the predator who thrived on chaos, each one proved that a killer's weapon is never just in their hands. It's in the way they move through the world unseen. These were not stories pulled from the edges of possibility. They happened in the same towns we live in, the same hospitals we trust, the same streets we walk without looking over our shoulders. They remind us that evil does not always roar, sometimes it whispers. And if history has taught us anything, it's that there is always another name waiting to be added to the list.